The town of Harrows Creek was not yet old enough to be humble. It sat at the base of the high Colorado Plateau, like a man who had just won his first real fight, bruised, breathing hard, but grinning wide enough to show all his teeth. 6 years old in the autumn of 1887, it had survived drought, a flash flood that took out the lower bridge, and two winters that most of the original settlers still spoke about, with a kind of reverent pride the way soldiers speak of battles they are glad are behind them. It had a general store, a livery, a small church without a permanent minister, and 31 structures ranging from solid two-room log cabins to a few ambitious frame houses with glass windows ordered all the way from Denver. The streets, if you could call them that, were dirt tracks worn smooth by wagon wheels and boot leather. In the summer, they were dust. In the spring, they were mud. But they were there, and that permanence meant something to the people who had carved this place out of nothing. The people of Harrows Creek believed in things they could touch. They believed in the sharp bite of a well-sharpened axe and the satisfying thunk of a maul splitting a round of seasoned oak clean in two. They believed in straight walls and tight chinked logs and the honest, reliable heat of a cast-iron stove with a patent date stamped into its side like a certificate of civilization. They measured a man's worth by the height of his woodpile and the number of hogs he put up before the first hard frost. They measured a woman's worth by the quality of her preserves and the straightness of her hem. They were not unkind people. They were simply people who had decided after the enormous effort of surviving that the world made a certain kind of sense, and they were not in the habit of welcoming arguments to the contrary. At the center of this world stood Wade Holt. He was 44 years old and built like the land itself, broad and dense, and somehow immovable. His hands were the size of small shovels, the knuckles permanently darkened by a decade of hard use. He had come to Harrows Creek in the second year of the settlement with his wife Cora and a young son named Arlo, and he had immediately set about making himself indispensable. He built things. That was his gift and his identity. He had built the livery, the general store's back addition, and 9 of the 31 structures in the settlement, including his own home, which was the largest in Harrows Creek by a comfortable margin. It had 2 full rooms, a sleeping loft, a porch that faced south to catch the winter sun, and a cast iron range that weighed 400 pounds and had cost more than most men earned in 3 months. When Wade Holt spoke, people listened, not because he demanded it, but because he had earned the right. Log by log and stone by stone, and everyone in Harrows Creek understood that currency. His woodpile was famous. It stood on the south side of his property, stacked in 3 long rows, each row 8 feet high and 30 feet long. He had begun it in early July, working every evening after supper, splitting and stacking, with a methodical, almost ceremonial dedication. By October, it was a monument, a dark fortress of split oak and pine that caught the evening light and threw long shadows across the yard. Men would ride by and slow their horses to look at it the way people slow to look at something that confirms their belief in the natural order of things. Wade accepted their admiration with a quiet nod, the nod of a man who has done what needs doing and sees no reason to make a fuss about it. Cora Holt watched her husband accept this admiration and said nothing. She was a precise woman, not cold but economical in the way of people who have learned that words spent carelessly are words wasted. She was 38 years old, dark-haired, with gray already threading through at her temples. She kept an immaculate kitchen garden, raised chickens with the focused seriousness of a general managing a small army, and had a habit of looking at things, buildings, people, situations with a slightly tilted head, as if she was finding the angle from which the truth was most visible. She loved her husband in the way you love a force of nature, with admiration and a certain quiet awareness of what it cannot do. Their son Arlo was 8 years old and had his father's dark eyes and his mother's precise, watchful manner. He had been a small, slightly delicate child since birth, prone to chest complaints in the cold months, and Cora had developed the habit of watching the sky in early autumn the way some women watch strangers, alert, assessing, making private calculations. It was Cora who first noticed the Arapaho traders had come early. They usually passed through in late October, moving down from the high summer country before the passes closed. This year they arrived in the second week of September, and there were fewer of them than usual, and their faces carried something that Cora could not name but recognized. It was the face of people who have received information they wish they had not. They traded quickly dried meat, some tanned hides, and they did not linger. Before they left, the eldest of them, a man with a face like weathered red clay, paused at the edge of the settlement and spoke to the small group that had gathered. He spoke slowly in his own language first, then in the halting English that served as the common tongue of trade. He talked about the pika, the small rock rabbits that lived in the boulder fields above the timberline. He said they were gathering their winter hay with a frantic, desperate energy he had never seen in 40 years of watching them. He talked about the aspen on the high ridges, which had not turned their usual clean gold, but had gone a sickly, bruised brown before dropping their leaves all at once, as if in fright. He talked about the absence of certain birds. He used a phrase that none of the settlers had heard before. He said it was going to be a wolf winter. Not a hard winter, not a long winter, a wolf winter, the kind that does not knock on the door, the kind that comes through the wall. Wade Holt listened with his arms crossed and his weight settled back on his heels, which was how he listened to things he had already decided not to believe. He thanked the man with genuine courtesy. He said they were well prepared. He gestured toward his woodpile, and several of the other men did the same, pointing to their own stacked cords with a pride that was only slightly performative. The traders left without looking back. That evening at the general store, where men gathered after supper to talk and play cards, Wade said what everyone was already thinking. These people read the land in ways that were real, he said, and they had his respect. But respect was one thing, and superstition was another. The settlement had stoves and walls and enough seasoned hardwood to see them through to April. This was not the wilderness anymore. This was a town. The men around the card table nodded and dealt another hand. No one noticed, or if they noticed, they did not remark upon it, that one person had not been part of the group at the general store. One person had stood at the edge of the gathering when the Arapaho elder spoke, listened with a stillness that was different from the stillness of polite boredom, and then walked home alone through the dry September dusk without speaking to anyone. Her name was Nora Gale, and she lived at the edge of everything. Her cabin was the last structure on the western side of Harrows Creek, where the settlement's last optimistic fence post gave way to the open plateau. It was a small cabin, a single room with a lean-to addition she had built herself the first winter after Everett died, using techniques she had learned from a manual on timber construction that she had read 3 times until she had it by heart. The cabin was not large, but it was meticulous. The chinking between the logs was tight and even. The roof had no sag. The small porch had a straight railing that she had replaced twice because the first 2 versions had not met her standard. A kitchen garden ran along the south wall, put to bed now for the season, the soil dark and turned and mounded in neat rows. A small shed stood 40 feet to the north of the back door, solid and plain, packed with the things a woman alone needs to keep herself alive through a Colorado winter. Nora was 65 years old. She did not look old in the way that invites pity. She looked old in the way a stone outcropping looks old, shaped by time into something spare and precise and completely suited to where it stands. Her hair was white, pulled back in a knot at the base of her neck, without any particular vanity. Her hands were strong and capable. Her eyes were the particular shade of gray that comes from spending many years looking at distances. She moved without waste, every motion purposeful, the economy of someone who has done the arithmetic on her own strength and knows exactly what she has to spend. She had come to Harrows Creek with Everett 6 years ago in the summer of 1881, among the first settlers to break ground on this particular stretch of high plateau. Everett Gale had been a mining engineer, a careful and intelligent man who had spent 20 years working the hard rock mines of Pennsylvania and Nevada before his lungs began to give out, and the company doctor told him the underground was finished for him. They had come west for the altitude and the dry air and the hope that the wide open spaces could do what the mines had undone. For 4 years, Everett had been a useful man in Harrows Creek. He knew how structures worked. He knew how the earth behaved under pressure. He consulted on the well placement in the drainage of the lower road and advised 3 families on how to site their cabins to get the best of the winter sun and the least of the prevailing wind. He was a quiet, thoughtful presence, and when he died in the spring of 1885, the settlement had mourned him genuinely. What they did not know, what Nora had never found a reason to tell them, was that Everett Gale, brilliant and careful as he was, had spent the last years of his life reading aloud to his wife every evening by lantern light from the engineering journals and mining manuals and geological surveys that arrived in his mail. And Nora, who had grown up the daughter of a school teacher in Ohio and had read everything she could get her hands on since the age of 6, had listened with a quality of attention that Everett himself sometimes found unnerving. She had asked questions. She had disagreed occasionally. She had kept her own notebook at first as a way of helping Everett organize his thoughts, and then gradually because her thoughts had become her own. The notebook was in the kitchen cabinet on the middle shelf next to a tin of dried lavender and a small daguerreotype of Everett taken in Pennsylvania in 1872. It was a plain journal with a brown cloth cover, its spine reinforced with a strip of rawhide that she had added when the original binding began to fail. The first 40 pages were in Everett's handwriting, neat, precise, slightly forward-leaning, the handwriting of a man trained to write specifications. Notes on geothermal gradients, observations on frost line depths at different altitudes, sketches of shoring systems used in the tin mines of Cornwall and the copper mines of Michigan, theories about passive thermal regulation in structures built below grade. These 40 pages were valuable. They were the record of a fine mind working on an interesting problem. The next 120 pages were in Nora's handwriting. Her hand was different from Everett's, denser, more angular, with a compressed efficiency that came from years of writing on limited paper. Where Everett had sketched ideas, Nora had developed them. Where Everett had noted questions, Nora had worked toward answers. The pages were filled with calculations, with revised diagrams, with marginal notes correcting earlier marginal notes. There were pages of soil analysis drawn from her observations in the garden over 6 years of digging in Harrows Creek's specific earth. There were tables estimating frost line depths based on temperature records she had kept herself in a small pocket diary every winter since they arrived. There was a complete technical drawing, 12 inches by 8, executed in pencil, with a steadiness of hand that would not have embarrassed a professional draftsman, showing a cross-section of a covered passage with all dimensions labeled the shoring system, detailed the waterproofing layer specified, and the ventilation baffles drawn to scale. At the bottom of this drawing in Everett's handwriting were 6 words. They were the last thing he had written in the notebook before he became too ill to hold a pen. Nora will know what to do with this. She had read those words so many times in the 2 years since his death that she no longer needed to open the notebook to see them. They were simply part of her, like the white of her hair and the ache in her left knee on cold mornings, in the particular way she tilted her head when she was thinking hard about something that mattered. On the evening that the Arapaho traders left Harrows Creek, Nora sat at her kitchen table for a long time after supper, not reading, not working, just sitting with her hands flat on the table surface and her eyes on the window and the darkening plateau beyond it. The air that came through the gaps around the window frame was sharp with a quality she had not felt before in September. It had a presumptuousness to it, this air. It was not autumn air feeling its way toward winter. It was winter air that had simply arrived early and was not apologizing for it. She got up and took the notebook from the shelf. She did not read it. She knew it. She opened it to the technical drawing and set it on the table in the lamplight and looked at it for a long time, tracing the lines with her eyes. Then she closed the notebook, put it back on the shelf, and went to bed. In the morning, she took her shovel from the lean-to and drove it into the earth at the threshold of her back door. The sound it made was a soft, clean tearing, like the first sentence of a story. The topsoil here was rich and dark, built up over centuries of prairie grass, living and dying in place, and it came up in clean, heavy slabs when she cut it. She set these aside carefully, the sod squares stacked grass down on a piece of canvas she had laid out for the purpose. She would want them later. They were not dirt. They were the covering she would put back over her work when the work was done, and she had no intention of wasting them. She worked slowly with the economy of motion that age and long experience teach together. There was no theatrical effort in it, no performance for anyone watching. Each shovelful was lifted, turned and placed in the wheelbarrow with the same unhurried deliberateness. When the wheelbarrow was full, she trundled it to the growing pile at the edge of the yard, emptied it, and came back. She had learned from Everett's journals that a trench of this kind properly done would take a strong young man 4 to 6 weeks. She calculated she had 8 weeks before the first serious snow was likely. She was not a strong young man. She had time. It was 4 days before anyone took significant notice. May Sutton noticed first, which was not surprising. May lived on the next claim to the north, a widow of 3 years with 2 grown sons who had gone back east in a competence that she wore like a comfortable old coat. She was 42 years old, practical in a way that had nothing to do with coldness and everything to do with paying attention. She had been watching Nora from a polite distance since the first day of digging, and on the fourth morning she appeared at the edge of Nora's yard with a pail of fresh buttermilk and a look of careful neutrality on her face. She did not ask what Nora was doing. She set the buttermilk on the porch railing, looked at the trench, which was by now about 8 feet long and nearly 3 feet deep, its walls cut clean and slightly inward slanting, and then looked at Nora. "You planning to go all the way to the shed?" May asked. "Yes," Nora said. May nodded slowly, as if this answered a question she had been asking herself in private. She picked up the empty pail she had brought the buttermilk in. "I'll bring bread tomorrow," she said, and walked back to her own claim. That was the entirety of their conversation on the subject, and it was enough. The public notice came later that same day when Wade Holt and 3 other men rode back from a hunt on the high plateau, their pack horses laden with 2 good elk and a mule deer. They came down the western track, which ran close enough to Nora's property that the growing earthwork was impossible to miss. Wade reined in his horse without making a decision to do so. It was the kind of automatic stop that happens when the brain registers something unexpected before the conscious mind has caught up. The trench was perhaps 40 feet long now, a raw-edged scar running from the cabin's back door toward the woodshed, varying between 2 and 3 feet in depth. Beside it, the excavated earth had accumulated into a pile that was already waist-high on a standing man. Nora was in the trench itself, working at the deeper end, her head and shoulders visible above the cut edge. She was wearing canvas work trousers and a gray wool shirt, dark with sweat at the back and under the arms. Her shovel rang against something, a stone, and she paused to work it free with a pry bar. Wade sat on his horse and looked at this for a moment. Then the corners of his mouth moved. "You lose something, Mrs. Gale," he called. Nora looked up. She took in the 4 mounted men, their horses, the game on the pack horse. She set her pry bar against the trench wall. "No," she said, "building something." "A covered way," she said, "to the shed." Wade looked at the other men. One of them, a broad-faced man named Decker, leaned forward in his saddle with the squinting expression of a person trying to understand a joke. "You're digging a tunnel," Decker said. "A covered passage," Nora said. "Yes." Wade swung down from his horse. He was the kind of man who dismounts the way other men enter a room with a consciousness of the space he occupies. He walked to the edge of the trench and looked down into it. The walls he could see were not vertical but angled slightly inward, which he registered but did not understand. The bottom was level. She had been careful with the bottom. "Mrs. Gale," he said, and his voice had in it the particular gentleness that is actually a form of condescension, the tone of a man explaining something difficult to someone he has already decided cannot grasp it. "The snows get deep here, but they don't get that deep. And what happens come spring when the thaw gets into the walls? You're going to have yourself a muddy ditch and a hazard." Nora looked at the walls of her trench. "It won't collapse," she said. "The weight of the earth doesn't care what we want it to do," Wade said. "It goes where it wants." "It goes where the pressure is lowest," Nora said. Her voice was quiet and had no argument in it, which somehow made it more difficult to argue with. "If the walls are shaped right and the shoring is right, the pressure distributes. It's stable." Wade looked at her for a long moment. He was a man who had genuine respect for competence and genuine difficulty recognizing it in forms he had not anticipated. He could see that she was not confused and she was not rambling. She believed what she was saying. This made it more important to him, not less, to explain why she was wrong. "You should be putting that energy into your woodpile," he said, his tone shifting towards something more direct. "A woman alone at your age, that's where your strength needs to go. Not into digging your own." He stopped himself. Nora had continued looking at him throughout this speech. Her expression had not changed. When he stopped, she simply picked up her pry bar and turned back to the stone she had been working on. "Thank you for the advice, Mr. Holt," she said. There was nothing hostile in her voice. There was also nothing that suggested she had heard a single word he had said in a way that would change what she did next. Wade stood there for a moment, the pry bar working steadily at the stone, the sound of it unhurried and patient and utterly indifferent to his presence. Then he walked back to his horse, and the men rode on. That evening at the general store, the story was told. By the time Decker had finished his version, which expanded naturally in the telling, the whole settlement had a new entertainment. The general consensus was that grief had done something to Nora Gale's judgment, which had always been on the eccentric side, even when Everett was alive to balance it out. A few of the women said it was sympathy. Most of the men said it with the slightly nervous humor of people who are relieved that someone else is demonstrating the kind of vulnerability they are determined not to show themselves. Wade called it Nora's folly, and the name stuck the way names do when they confirm something people had already half decided. In the weeks that followed, the folly grew. September moved into October with a steady, beautiful clarity that the high plateau does every autumn, the sky an impossible blue, the air cold and clean in the mornings, and warm enough by afternoon to work in shirt sleeves. The aspens on the ridges were turning, though not their usual brilliant gold. They were muted this year, more copper than gold, and some of them were dropping their leaves early, not in the usual drifting cascade, but in the sudden anxious clusters, as if shaking something off. Nora noticed this. She recorded it in the small pocket diary she kept on the kitchen windowsill. The trench deepened. She moved through the palmo and into the subsoil, which was a different kind of work entirely. The earth here was a dense red-tinged clay packed with rocks that had to be worked free individually with the pry bar and the patience of someone who has nowhere more important to be. Each rock was a small, specific argument with the earth, and she won each one by not hurrying. Her wheelbarrow, which had rolled easily when loaded with the light topsoil, became a test of will when packed with the dense clay. She emptied it in stages. She rested when she needed to and did not apologize for it. Her hands blistered in new places. She bandaged them at night with tallow and clean linen strips, and in the morning picked up the shovel again. Her back sent its complaints as backs do in a language of dull insistence that she had learned to translate as information rather than command. She adjusted her posture, changed her grip, found positions that distributed the load differently. She was not trying to ignore her body. She was negotiating with it. The trench had reached 4 feet of depth when old Carver came. Theodore Carver was 81 years old and had been a hard rock miner for 50 years before his joints made underground work impossible, and he had come to Harrow's Creek to live out his remaining time somewhere with decent air. He was a small, leathery man who moved with the slow, deliberate caution of very old people and very experienced ones, which in his case were the same thing. He rarely left his cabin except to sit in the sun on his porch in the afternoons, and his appearance on the western edge of the settlement on a bright October morning was unusual enough that the 2 women washing clothes at the community pump stopped and watched him walk past with their hands still submerged in the water. He came to the edge of Nora's trench and looked down into it. Nora was at the deep end working the wall with her shovel. She heard his footsteps and looked up. She saw the old man standing at the rim, his head cocked to one side, his pale eyes moving along the angle of the walls with the particular focused attention of someone reading something in their original language. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That's a Cornish batter." Nora set her shovel against the wall. "Yes," she said. "The angle's right," he said, still looking at the wall. "You want to go steeper than that, and the clay starts pushing against itself. You want shallower, and you're wasting your width." He paused. "Everett teach you that?" "I taught myself," Nora said. Carver looked at her for the first time since he had arrived at the edge of the trench. He had the eyes of a man who has seen enough of the world to have strong opinions about very little and strong certainties about the few things that genuinely matter. He looked at her the way he had looked at the walls of her trench, with assessment rather than judgment. Then he nodded once, a single, slow inclination of his head that meant something more than agreement. "Frost line here at this altitude, hard winter. You want 6 feet of depth," he said, "maybe 6.5. "I know," Nora said. Carver nodded again. He stood for another moment looking into the trench. Then he turned and walked back the way he had come, moving through the dry October grass with his careful, deliberate shuffle. He said nothing more. He asked no questions. He offered no further instruction. He had confirmed what needed confirming and left. That was all. What Nora did not know, what she learned only later, was that Wade Holt had been riding along the western track on his way to check on a neighbor's fence when he saw Carver standing at the edge of the trench. He had reined in at a distance and watched. He had seen the old miner looking down, had seen the single nod, had seen Nora's response. He had been too far away to hear the exchange, And so he had constructed his own interpretation of what he saw, which was the interpretation most consistent with what he already believed. He told it that evening at the store. Old Carver had been down to look at the trench, he said. Even Carver shook his head. The old man hadn't said a word, just looked at the whole business and walked away. The men around the table agreed that if Carver, who had dug more holes in the earth than anyone living, couldn't find anything to say in defense of it, that was the clearest verdict possible. Wade was not lying. He had seen exactly what he had described. He had simply lacked the information to understand it. Through October, Nora's folly deepened and lengthened. She reached 6 feet of depth at the far end near the woodshed and worked back toward the house, maintaining the grade with a level she had made herself from a straight-cut pine board and a small glass tube of water. The level mattered. A passage that collected water at either end was a passage that became a swamp at the first thaw, and a swamp was useless. The floor of the trench had to have a slight, consistent pitch away from the cabin door, just enough to let water find its way out, not enough to be felt underfoot. She checked the grade every 6 feet. She corrected it twice. She was not in a hurry. The shoring timber took 2 weeks to source and prepare. She could not afford milled lumber from the sawmill in the valley, and milled lumber would have been inferior anyway for this purpose. Green wood shrank and cracked and let the earth in. She wanted seasoned deadwood hardwood that had already done its contracting and expanding and arrived at its final dimensions. She hitched her mule to the small cart and spent 4 days ranging through the creek bottoms and the edge timber, reading the standing dead trees the way Everett had taught her, looking for the particular gray-white of dry oak and the heavy dense grain of ash. She dragged them back and worked them with a broad adze and an adze in the evening, squaring the legs and cutting the collar beams to length. The joints she cut with a saw and a half-inch chisel mortise and tenon, each one fitted by hand, each one pegged with a dry oak dowel that she had split and dried herself specifically for this purpose. The dry oak would absorb moisture from the earth and expand in the joint, locking it into a unit that could not be pulled apart without destroying the wood itself. It was the same principle used in the deep-level mines of Cornwall, which she knew from the journals, and in the best timber framing of New England, which she knew from a building manual Everett had owned. Her hands, accustomed to the shovel, found the chisel work difficult at first. She cut slowly. She had 2 failures joints where the mortise was slightly off square and the tenon did not seat cleanly, and she cut new timber for those and tried again. By the time she had 40 frames built and stacked against the north wall of the shed, the joints were clean and tight, and she could assemble a frame in under 20 minutes. She began to install them in the second week of October, working from the cabin toward the shed. She lowered the heavy timbers into the trench, seated the legs in the clay at the measured spacing, and drove the joints home with a wooden mallet. Behind each frame, she packed in the rough, sawn lagging boards she had salvaged from a collapsed outbuilding on the old Mercer claim, pressing them tight against the clay walls, transferring the earth's pressure onto the frames where it could be managed rather than letting it work against the walls unsupported. The work was close and claustrophobic. The trench was 3 feet wide at the bottom, and with the frames in place, there was barely room to move. She worked in segments, setting 3 frames at a time and then retreating to the open air. She was careful. She was always careful. The roofing went on in the 3rd week of October. She laid the thick pine planks across the top of the A-frame collars, fitting them tight and caulking the seams with pine tar that she heated in a small pot over a fire. The smell was eye-wateringly strong, and she liked it. It was the smell of protection, of something being sealed against intrusion. Over the planked roof, she unrolled the salvaged canvas, 4 sections of oil-impregnated wagon cover that she had purchased the previous spring from a freighter who had written off a damaged wagon outside of town. She had stored the canvas in the shed all summer, waiting for the moment she would need it. She laid it in overlapping sections, weighting the edges with stones, while the pine tar she had applied to the planks dried and bonded. Then she began to backfill. She took the mountain of excavated earth, the topsoil she had kept separate, the dense red clay she had dug from the deeper layers, and she began to put it back. The clay went on first, packed down over the canvas in layers, each layer tamped with the flat of her shovel before the next went on. She worked to a depth of 3 feet over the crown of the roofing planks, and then she stopped and began to lay the sum. She put it down the way she had seen her mother put down a quilt, carefully, each square, overlapping slightly with the next pressed, flat, the roots in contact with the packed earth below. A week of mild weather and a light rain in late October helped it. By the 1st of November, the sod had begun to knit together. The seams were still visible, but they were fading. The wound in the earth was closing. At each end of the passage where the wooden steps descended to the doors, she had fitted into the cabin wall and the shed wall respectively. She built a small hooded entry, a three-sided wooden shelter, roofed with its open face turned away from the prevailing northwest wind. At the highest point of each run of the passage, she cut a small ventilation shaft and fitted it with a baffled wooden cap open at the side and screened with cloth to keep the insects out in summer. The baffles were angled so that the wind moving across them created a slight negative pressure, drawing stale air up and out, while fresh air entered naturally from the low-pressure side. She had read about this system in a paper on mine ventilation. She had adapted it from memory. She thought it would work. She was almost certain it would work. By the third week of October, Nora's folly was invisible. From the outside, the western yard of the last cabin in Harrow's Creek showed two low, gentle mounds of earth, leading to two unassuming hooded doorways, the kind of feature that could easily be mistaken for the entrance to a simple root cellar. The sod was greening again. A person riding past on the track would not have given it a second look. The town's interest had already moved on. The joke had run its course. Nora Gale was confirmed as eccentric, possibly touched, definitely harmless, and there were other things to talk about. The elk hunting had been exceptional. Caleb Fitch was building a new addition to the general store. Wade Holt's youngest neighbor had a wife expecting in December, and there was already a discussion about whether the settlement was large enough to justify sending for a doctor from the valley town. Nora went about her remaining preparations without comment or announcement. She had always kept a substantial larder, a habit from the Ohio winters of her childhood, reinforced by 6 years of Colorado altitude, and she added to it now with systematic precision. She put up the last of the root vegetables from the garden packed in dry sand and wooden crates. She traded a week of sewing work to a neighbor for an extra 50 pounds of dried beans. She laid in salt flour lard, dried fruit coffee, and 2 gallons of rendered tallow for the lamps. She checked and rechecked the small stove in the cabin and cleaned the flue with a brush she had made herself from a bundle of wire and a wooden dowel. She filled every container she owned with water against the possibility of the well freezing, which at her altitude was not a possibility, but a certainty if the winter was hard enough. In the woodshed at the far end of the passage, she reorganized the stacked cordwood so that the driest, most seasoned pieces were accessible first, with the green wood at the back. She had enough, she calculated, for 12 weeks of steady burning in a hard winter. She was not planning to burn it steadily. She had a different plan for staying warm, and the wood was the backup to the backup. She also, on a quiet afternoon in late October, prepared a small alcove in the back corner of the woodshed. She set a small iron brazier there filled with charcoal. She arranged 2 folded blankets on a wooden shelf. She hung a small lantern from a peg on the rafter. She placed on a second shelf a covered pot of dried beans, already soaked and ready to cook, a sealed crock of beef broth, a tin of hardtack, and a cloth-wrapped parcel of dried apples. She set out 2 tin mugs. She set out a small bottle of laudanum and a packet of willow bark and a clean bandage roll. She stood back and looked at what she had assembled and felt something settle in her chest. Not satisfaction exactly. Something quieter than satisfaction. Something closer to readiness. She thought of Everett's last words in the notebook and was not sad, or not only sad. She was something else as well, something that required the two of them, what he had given her and what she had made of it, and something that now, standing in the lamplight at the end of her passage under the earth, she could not put a name to, but recognized as her own. She locked the shed. She went back through the passage, feeling the temperature change as she descended the steps, the cool, still neutral air of the deep earth closing around her like an old friend, and she climbed up into the cabin and shut the door behind her. Above the high ridges to the northwest, the sky that evening was the color of old pewter. There were no stars. The air was absolutely still in the way that air is still only when it is holding something back. It smelled of iron and distance. It smelled of nothing alive. Nora stood on her porch for a long moment, her hands in her apron pockets, looking at that sky. Her breath did not steam. It was not cold enough yet for that, but it would be. She went inside, lit the lamp, and opened the notebook to Everett's drawing. She looked at it for a long time, not as a set of instructions, she had gone beyond instructions, but as a kind of company. Then she closed it carefully and put it back on the shelf. She put a small log on the fire, set the kettle on, and sat down at the table to wait for whatever was coming. She had been waiting her whole life to be ready for something like this. She was ready. The stillness came first. It arrived on the morning of the 10th of November like a held breath, a sudden unnatural cessation of the wind that had been a constant presence on the plateau for as long as anyone in Harrow's Creek could remember. The aspens along the creek bottom stopped moving. The dry grass stood straight. The weather vane on top of the livery, which had not been still in 3 years, pointed northwest and did not move from that position for the rest of the day. Dogs that normally ranged freely through the settlement stayed close to their owners' doors, lying flat with their chins on their paws and their eyes tracking things that were not visible to human senses. The sky pressed down low and featureless, the color of an old bruise without the texture that normal cloud cover has. It was a ceiling, not a sky. It had weight. People noticed and said nothing because there was nothing comfortable to say. Wade Holt spent the morning of the 10th checking his woodpile, which did not need checking. He walked its length, rapped his knuckles against the end logs, the way a man raps his knuckles on a wall to confirm it is solid, looked at the tarp he had lashed over the top with a network of rope that he had triple knotted at every junction. Everything was in order. Everything was exactly as it should be. He went back inside, poured himself a cup of coffee, and stood at the window looking at the sky with the expression of a general who has deployed all his forces and is now waiting for the battle to confirm his strategy. Cora watched him from the kitchen. She said nothing. She went to the chest at the foot of the bed and took out 2 extra blankets and laid them over the back of the settle by the stove where they would be accessible quickly. She checked the water barrels. She looked at Arlo, who was sitting at the table doing his reading lesson, and she put her hand briefly on the back of his neck, not as a gesture of affection, though it was that too, but as a temperature check. His skin was warm and dry. He looked up at her with his father's dark eyes, and she smoothed his hair and said nothing. On the morning of the 12th, the snow started. It did not start the way snow normally starts, with single exploratory flakes drifting down from a tentative sky, testing the air and seeing how it is received. It started all at once the way a fist hits a table. One moment the air was still and gray and empty. The next moment it was white. Not white with falling snow, but white with driven snow, horizontal granular, moving with a velocity that made it hiss against the window glass like sand. And behind the snow came the wind, which had apparently spent the last 2 days gathering itself somewhere to the northwest and had arrived now with everything it had collected. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the first hour, then 20. Wade stoked the stove and listened to the wind work its way around the corners of his cabin and felt the familiar, comfortable pride of a man inside a structure he built himself. The logs were 16 inches thick at the smallest. The chinking was tight. The stove was throwing heat with an authority that pushed back against the cold, coming through the walls in a way that felt entirely manageable. He put his hand on Arlo's shoulder and said with complete conviction, "Let it blow." Arlo looked at the window where nothing was visible but white and pressed closer to his father's side. The first day was almost pleasant in the way that any extreme is briefly interesting before it becomes a problem. The settlers of Harrow's Creek retreated to their cabins, stoked their fires, and settled in with the slightly festive atmosphere of people who have prepared for exactly this and are now in the gratifying position of seeing their preparation validated. At Wade's cabin, Cora heated apple cider with cinnamon on the range. Arlo lay on the bearskin rug in front of the stove with a picture book and fell asleep there flushed and comfortable. Wade sat by the fire with his accounts book adding up figures that all confirmed what he already believed about his situation. He went through half a box of wood by midday. He noted this but did not find it alarming. He brought in another box from the porch stack, the 8-cord reserve he kept under the overhang, specifically for these first days, to avoid unnecessary trips to the main pile. The porch stack would last 4 days at normal burn. He was burning faster than normal, but not dramatically so. He adjusted his estimate and went back to his accounts. By evening, the porch stack was almost gone. He recalculated. The stove was consuming wood at nearly twice the rate he had planned, for which meant the cold was pulling heat out of the cabin at twice the rate his walls were supposed to allow. He did not say this to Cora. He put the last log from the porch stack into the stove and listened to the wind and thought about his main pile. The main pile was 40 feet from the back door. In normal winter conditions, which meant snow that fell vertically, wind that came in gusts, rather than as a sustained wall temperatures that dropped to single digits and recovered 40 feet, was nothing. A man could walk it in 20 seconds. You stepped out, you grabbed an armload of wood, you came back. The cold was unpleasant, but it was brief. These were not normal winter conditions. When Wade opened the back door the following morning to make his first trip to the main pile, the storm hit him with a physical force that snapped his head back and drove the breath from his lungs. The temperature was somewhere below -20. The wind was not gusting, it was constant, a solid moving wall of frozen air that pressed against him with the insistence of something with intention. The snow was not falling so much as existing everywhere simultaneously, a permanent feature of the atmosphere flying horizontal at a speed that reduced visibility to the distance of his own outstretched arm. He had his rope ready. He had tied one end to the back door handle the evening before following a practice he had heard about from older settlers, but had never needed until now. He fed the rope out hand over hand, leaning into the wind, his eyes pressed to slits by the cold. Every step required a conscious decision. The drifts, which had been knee-high the day before, were now thigh-deep in places and chest-deep in the hollow beside the shed. He waded through them, feeling the cold work through his coat and his wool underlayer, and reached his skin within the first 30 seconds. He reached the main pile in what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably closer to 2. What he found stopped him. The tarp was gone, not torn gone. The triple knotted rope he had used to lash it down had held, but the tarp itself had failed at the grommets, shredded by the wind at some point in the night, and the pieces had been carried away by a storm that had no interest in the arrangements of men. The wood that the tarp had covered was now fully exposed, and the driven snow had found every gap between the logs and packed into it with extraordinary efficiency. The stacked cords were cemented together, front logs frozen to middle logs frozen to bottom logs, in a mass that was no longer a wood pile but a wall, a solid uniform block of frozen wood and compressed ice. Wade stared at this for 3 seconds in the howling white chaos. Then he reached for the top log. It did not move. He grabbed it with both hands and pulled, and felt the resistance of something that was not going to yield to a simple pull. He shifted his grip, set his feet against the base of the pile, and heaved with his full strength. The log came free with a sound like a gunshot, a sharp explosive crack as the ice bond broke, and the force of its release sent him stumbling backward into a drift. He had one log. He tucked it under his arm and fought his way back to the cabin. The trip that had taken 2 minutes going out took 4 minutes coming back, because now he was moving against the wind instead of across it, and the wind had decided opinions about his direction of travel. He arrived at the back door with ice in his beard, his eyelashes frozen together, the exposed skin of his face aching with a deep, penetrating cold that felt less like temperature and more like a substance. He put the log in the stove, one log. He looked at the stove and looked at the back door and did the mathematics that he did not want to do. He went out again. He went out again and again and again through that second day and into the second night, each trip a small war against the cold and the wind and the frozen mass of his own woodpile, each trip yielding 2 or 3 logs at most, before his hands became too numb to grip the axe he now had to carry to break the logs free of the ice. He came in from each trip diminished a little colder, each time a little slower to warm back up a little more, aware of the distance between what he had planned and what was happening. Cora watched him with her tilted head expression and did not say what she was thinking. She fed him hot food when he came in, wrapped his hands in warm cloths, held his face between her palms to bring the color back. She banked the stove between his trips to slow the burn, which made the room colder but made the wood last longer, and she pulled the spare blankets around Arlo, who had begun coughing on the afternoon of the second day. The cough was dry at first, a clearing of the throat sound, the kind of thing that in a healthy child means nothing. Cora put her palm on his forehead when he was not looking. The skin there was warmer than it should have been, not alarming yet. The word "yet" was doing a great deal of work in her private assessment of the situation. The temperature dropped again in the night between the second and third day. Wade's thermometer, mounted on the exterior wall beside the back door, had a scale that went to 40 below. When he checked it before his first morning trip on the third day, the spirit column had descended to a point he had to estimate because the scale did not extend to where the liquid had settled. He estimated -35. He went back inside and told Cora the range was 30 to 35 below, which was accurate, and he did not tell her about the scale. The wood he brought in from the main pile was now burning wrong. He had not understood why until the third day, when Arlo's cough deepened and the boy began to breathe with a shallow, effortful quality that made Cora's eyes sharpen and her mouth tighten. The smoke from the stove had a thick, acrid edge to it, different from the clean bite of well-seasoned oak. Wade leaned close to the stove, turned a burning log with the poker, and saw what he had been slow to see. The interior of his main pile, the wood at the heart of those poignous, beautiful rows, had been green when he stacked it. He had known this at the time. In a normal winter, it would not have mattered much. The outer logs would burn first, and by the time he reached the inner layers, the season would be moderating. But this was not a normal winter, and the outer logs were cemented in ice, and the logs he was able to break free were the ones closest to the center. The wood was saturated. It burned slow and smoky and incomplete. It produced heat, but it produced with it a dense resinous smoke that was finding its way back into the room through the draft gaps around the stovepipe joints. And that smoke was what Arlo was breathing. Wade sat on his heels in front of the stove with the poker in his hand and looked at the smoking log and felt something move through him that he had not felt in a very long time. It had no name that he was willing to give it yet, but it lived in the chest just below the sternum, and it was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. He opened the flue to full, and the draft improved, and some of the smoke cleared. But the wood still burned wet, and the heat was irregular, roaring for a few minutes, when the dry outer layer of a log caught, then dropping back as the waterlogged interior choked the flame. The room temperature swung in 20-degree arcs. When it dropped, Arlo coughed. When it dropped far enough and Arlo coughed hard enough, the boy brought up a thread of dark mucus that Cora wiped away quickly with a cloth, but not quickly enough that Wade did not see it. He went out again. He was not sure anymore whether he was going out to get wood or going out because the alternative was standing in the cabin doing the kind of thinking he was not yet ready to do. The storm outside was honest in a way the interior of his own head was not. Outside, the enemy was clear, and the directions were clear, and the rope in his hand was a clear and simple connection to the only safe thing within reach. He went out and he broke logs free with the axe, and he carried them back and he put them in the stove, and he sat with his hands around a mug of hot water because the coffee was nearly gone, and he watched his son breathe. By the end of the third day, the wood in the accessible sections of the main pile was almost exhausted. He had burned through what should have been 2 weeks of normal winter heating in 3 days of desperate emergency burning. The pile that had been his monument, the structure that men had slowed their horses to admire, was a frozen ruin, its outer accessible sections stripped, its intersections too green and wet to burn cleanly, the whole mass welded together by ice in a configuration that would require a full day of axe work to break apart even in good conditions. He did not sleep on the third night. He sat by the stove and fed it carefully the way you feed a sick animal small amounts frequently, watching the response. He had brought in everything he could find, the few logs left from the porch overhang, a bundle of branches he had stacked loosely against the shed wall, a collection of pine kindling that was fortunately dry. He rationed this fuel with a precision that would have alarmed him in any other context, because the precision of it admitted the seriousness of the situation in a way that he was fighting to defer. Arlo slept fitfully, his breathing audible from across the room. At 2 in the morning, he called out in his sleep a single indistinct word, and Cora was at his side before he had finished the syllable. She sat with him until he settled again, her hand on his back, her face turned away from the light, so Wade could not see her expression. On the morning of the 4th day across the settlement, May Sutton made a decision. May had been alone in her cabin since the storm began, and she was better prepared than most. She had a tight structure, a good stove, and enough dry wood in her covered side porch to last 3 weeks. She was not in danger, but she had been sitting with a thought since the first morning of the storm that would not leave her alone, and by the 4th day it had become less a thought than a physical sensation, a pressure behind her sternum that she associated with the specific discomfort of knowing what you should do and not yet having done it. She was thinking about Nora. Not because Nora needed her. May was not under any illusion that Nora Gale needed saving. She was thinking about Nora because she was the only person in Harrow's Creek who knew from the specific quality of attention she had given the trench and the entry hoods and the way the sod had been laid back, that what Nora had built was not a folly. It was the only thing in this settlement that had been built for exactly this. And May had spent 4 days sitting with the knowledge that the woman who had built it was 40 yards away to the south, and that 40 yards in this storm was a distance that required a decision. She made the decision at 7 in the morning. She dressed in everything she owned: 2 pairs of wool socks, her heaviest skirt over canvas work trousers, 3 layers on her upper body, with the outermost being a man's canvas coat she had inherited from her late husband, which was too large for her and therefore, when layered over everything else, exactly right. She wrapped a wool scarf around her face until only her eyes were clear. She tied a length of rope to the door handle, checked the knot, coiled the rest over her shoulder. She opened the door. The storm entered the cabin the way a river enters a breach, with total commitment, all at once, without any recognition of the boundary it was crossing. The cold was immediate and absolute, not a temperature, but a presence, something with mass and intention. The wind screamed in the gap of the open door and threw a sheet of hard granular snow across the floor. May leaned into it and stepped out and pulled the door shut behind her. The world outside the door was white and nothing else. She paid out the rope hand over hand and moved in the direction she believed was south, which was the direction of Nora's claim. The drifts were deep, thigh-high, and higher, packed hard by the wind into shapes that bore no relation to the natural terrain beneath them. She waded through them and around them where she could, testing each step before committing her weight, the rope her only anchor to the known world. She had gone perhaps 20 yards when she went down. The drift she stepped into was not a drift. It was a hollow, a place where the wind had scooped the snow from the surface of the earth and deposited it elsewhere, leaving a depression of packed ice beneath a deceptive surface layer. Her foot went through the surface, and her momentum carried her forward, and she hit the ground on her hands and knees with a force that drove the breath from her body in a single hard exhalation that the wind took immediately. She lay there for a moment. Her hands, in contact with the frozen ground, were already losing sensation through her gloves. She pushed herself up, found her feet, found the rope, and stood. She could not see anything. She could not hear anything except the wind. She did not know precisely how far she had come or exactly how far she had to go. The rope behind her was her only reference point, and the rope only led back to the place she had come from. She moved forward. She was 15 feet from Nora's back entry hood, though she did not know this because the hood itself was buried under 3 feet of drifted snow and invisible when she went down again. This time the drift was waist deep, and she went into it face first, and the cold hit her exposed eyes, and the snow filled the gap between her scarf and her collar, and she came up fighting and disoriented, and for a terrible 3-second interval, she did not know which direction she was facing. She got her feet under her. She turned until the wind was on her left cheek, which was the way she had been moving. She took one step and felt her legs, which had been strong and steady 10 minutes ago, refused to respond with anything like the authority she expected from them. The cold had done something to the communication between her brain and her lower body. She took another step. She was moving, but not well. Nora was at her kitchen window. She had been at her kitchen window intermittently since the storm began, not from anxiety, or not only from anxiety, but from the same impulse that makes a person check the weather when they can do nothing about it, the need to see what is actually happening rather than only imagining it. She had developed over 4 days of watching the white chaos outside her glass a specific skill of interpretation. She could distinguish snow from sky movement, from static chaos, by a quality of shadow and density that was not obvious to an untrained eye. What she saw at just past 7:30 on the morning of the 4th day was a darkness in the white that was the wrong shape for any natural feature of the landscape. It was upright, then it was not upright. Then it was upright again, and moving, and it was in the wrong place, not on the track, not in any direction that made sense, and it was moving wrong, lurching and hesitant, like something running down. Nora was at the back door before she had made a conscious decision to move. She did not go through the back door. She went through the inner passage door, down the steps, into the tunnel, and through the tunnel to the woodshed, and in 30 seconds of quick, sure movement, in the cool and total stillness of the underground. She unlatched the shed's outer door, the one facing the yard, and opened it 6 inches. The storm came in, cold, violent, absolute. She could see nothing from the shed door. The entry hood that covered the woodshed entrance had drifted over, and the snow pressed against the bottom of the door with a weight that resisted its opening. She pushed it wider and stepped out into the drift, sinking to her knees immediately, and squinted into the white. There, 15 feet, a shape on the ground. Nora moved toward it without hesitation, pushing through the drift with her body using her arms like oars. The cold hit her forearms and her face, and she registered it as information. Very cold time limited act now, and she kept moving. She reached the shape in the drift, which was May Sutton on her hands and knees, with her head down, the rope still coiled over her shoulder, her arms shaking with the effort of holding herself off the frozen ground. Nora grabbed her by the back of the canvas coat. She did not try to lift May. She pulled her backward toward the shed door using her own body as a plow and May's substantial dead weight as a sled. Her shoulders screamed. Her feet slipped twice on the icy ground beneath the drift. She fell once, got up, did not stop pulling. 15 feet had never felt so long. The cold was no longer a presence at the surface of her skin. It was inside now, working on the deep muscles, and she could feel her hands beginning to lose their grip on the coat fabric. She got May through the shed door. She got the door shut. She sat on the floor of the woodshed with May's head in her lap for a full 30 seconds, both of them breathing with the effortful concentration of people who have been reminded that breathing is not automatic. Then she got May on her feet, got her arm across her shoulders, and walked her through the tunnel. The change in the air as they descended the steps into the passage was immediate. The wind cut off as though a switch had been thrown. The temperature rose 20 degrees in the space of 3 steps. The earth closed around them, still neutral, indifferent to the catastrophe happening 6 feet above their heads. May made a sound, not a word, something below language, a sound of pure physical relief, and her legs buckled slightly, and Nora held her up and kept walking. They came up the steps into the cabin. The warmth of the room was extraordinary. Not the aggressive, uneven heat of an overstoked stove fighting against impossible cold. A deep, settled warmth, the kind that lives in the walls and the floor and the air itself, that does not spike and drop, but simply persists like something that has been here a long time and sees no reason to leave. A small fire burned in the stove, not the roaring inferno that other settlers were feeding with desperate frequency, but a low, steady flame, a fire burning at exactly the rate it needed to burn. On the range, a kettle was just beginning to steam. May stood in the middle of the room and looked at it. Her face, as the frozen surface of it began to thaw, moved through several expressions in quick succession. She looked at the low fire. She looked at the walls. She put her hand on the log wall beside her and held it there, and felt the warmth that had accumulated in the wood over 4 days of the earth, doing what the earth does 6 feet below the surface of the world. Then she sat down in the chair nearest the stove and put her face in her hands. Nora did not say anything. She pulled May's outer coat off her, unwound. The scarf checked her hands and face for the white waxy patches of frostbite. She found 2 small spots on May's left cheek and 1 on the outer edge of her right ear. She treated them with the deliberate, gentle efficiency of someone who knows what to do and does not waste time being upset that the knowledge is necessary. She set the treated hand in May's lap, wrapped it in a dry cloth, and poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the range. She set 1 cup in front of May and sat down across from her with the other. May looked up. Her eyes were wet, not from crying, not yet, but from the cold, from the transition from whatever it is that happens to the body when it has been very close to the edge of its own capacity and has been pulled back. She looked at the small fire. She looked at Nora. She looked at the walls. "How is it this warm?" she said. Her voice was rough. "The earth holds it," Nora said. May was quiet for a moment. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and held it. "People are in trouble out there," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Nora said. "Wade's pile," May said. "I could see it from my window on the 2nd day. The tarp was gone." Nora nodded slowly. "He's going to run out," May said. "Yes," Nora said again. They sat with this. The small fire made its quiet sounds. Outside, at a volume so constant it had become almost subliminal, the storm pressed against the walls and found nothing to use. The walls did not respond because they had the earth behind them, and the earth had made its own arrangements with the cold long before the storm and had not changed them. Back in Wade Holt's cabin, the 4th day was unraveling toward a conclusion that Wade was actively refusing to name. He had burned the last of the accessible wood from his pile, 10 in the morning. He had spent 4 hours after that attempting to break into the frozen interior sections, with the axe going out into the storm 3 times in conditions that were getting worse rather than better, returning each time with 3 or 4 logs that cost him 20 minutes of warmth from his own body to acquire. The mathematics of this exchange were not in his favor, and he knew it. Arlo's fever had climbed through the day. The boy was in bed now, under every blanket in the cabin, his breathing shallow and audible from the main room. He had stopped coughing, which would have been reassuring, except that Cora had explained in a quiet private voice while Arlo slept that the cessation of coughing was not improvement, it was the body concentrating its resources. She knew this because she had seen it before in her second nephew, and the word she used for what she had seen then was the word she did not say now. She looked at Wade when she finished speaking, and what was in her eyes was not accusation and it was not despair. It was the look of a woman who has done her private accounting and knows where things stand and is telling him clearly and without drama that they have arrived at the place where something must change. Wade walked to the window and looked out at nothing. He looked at his woodpile, which was a shape in the white he could barely see. He thought about what he had built and what it had cost and what it was worth. He thought about the elevation of his son's chest and the sound it made. He walked to the wood box beside the stove. It was empty except for 3 short pieces of pine kindling and a handful of bark scraps. He stared at this for a long moment. He walked to the corner of the room where Arlo's cradle stood. Arlo had not slept in it for 4 years. He was too large for it by half. It stood in the corner because neither Wade nor Cora had been willing to break it down, because it was the first piece of furniture Wade had built in this house, the first thing he had made for the life they were building here, and it was good work. He had used ash from a tree he had felled himself, had shaped the rockers with a spokes halve he had brought from Ohio, had fit the spindles with a precision that still held no looseness, no rattle 4 years later. Cora came and stood beside him. She did not speak. She did not need to. Wade picked up the axe from beside the door. He stood in front of the cradle with the axe at his side, and he looked at it for a long time. He looked at the ash runners and the smooth spindles, and the small wooden hood he had shaped for the head end. He looked at the joints, which were still tight. He raised the axe. The sound it made was not loud, but it was final. A single clean crack as the hood joint let go. Then another as the first rocker separated from the body. Then a series of shorter sounds, methodical, each one a specific and irreversible act of dismantling. The wood was dry and dense and would burn hot and long, which was why he had chosen ash. He put the pieces in the stove. The fire took hold immediately. The heat was immediate and generous, the way good seasoned hardwood gives heat openly without reservation. It filled the room with a warmth that was almost physical in its impact, and Wade stood in front of the stove and felt it on his face, and felt simultaneously the complete and irrevocable collapse of everything he had believed about how the world worked and what his place in it was. He was a man who had built this house. He was a man who had built half the structures in this settlement. He was a man who had stacked the largest woodpile in Harrow's Creek and called it preparation, and believed with complete sincerity that preparation was the same as safety. He had been wrong about something, and his son was sick, and he was burning the cradle he had built for that son, and the fire was warm, and the warmth was terrible. From the bed, barely audible over the wind and the sound of the burning, Arlo said, "Papa." Wade went to his son. Arlo's eyes were half open, dark and glassy with fever, his face flushed under the pile of blankets. He looked at his father with the direct, uncomplicated trust that sick children have, the trust that has not yet learned to account for the limitations of the people it is placed in. "Papa," he said again, "are we okay?" Wade sat on the edge of the bed. He put his large, raw hand on his son's forehead. The heat there was frightening. He kept his face entirely still. "Yes," he said. He sat there until the boy's eyes closed again. Then he stood up and walked back to the main room and stood looking at the fire, which was eating the last of the cradle with a bright, efficient hunger. The room was the warmest it had been in 2 days. It would not stay warm. The cradle would burn for 2 hours, maybe 3. The chairs would go next, and then the table. And then there would be nothing left to burn, and the room would begin to cool, and Arlo's fever would rise, or it would not. And whatever happened after that was beyond the reach of anything Wade Holt knew how to do. He stood there for a long time. Cora came and stood beside him. She did not touch him. She did not say anything for a while, and when she spoke, her voice was entirely steady, which was the most frightening thing about it. "We have to do something," she said. "He's burning up." Wade looked at the fire. He looked at the window. He looked at the door. He thought about Nora Gale. The thought came the way unwelcome truths come, not knocking, not announcing itself, just suddenly there fully formed in the center of his awareness, where he could not avoid it. He thought about the months of digging. He thought about the name he had given it, which was a name he had chosen to describe something he had decided was foolish, without examining whether it was actually foolish or whether it was only unfamiliar. He thought about the old miner standing at the edge of the trench and nodding once. He thought about what that nod might have meant, interpreted by someone who had not already decided what it meant. He thought about the light that would be in her window right now, if her chimney was still producing smoke, if her cabin was what he was afraid it might be, warm and steady, and entirely indifferent to the storm that was killing them. He stood with this thought, and it was a thought made of pure shame and pure necessity and pure love for the boy in the bed, and those three things together were stronger than everything he had built in the last 4 years, and he knew it. "I'm going to Nora's," he said. Cora looked at him. Her expression did not change. She had already been to this place in her thinking he could see that now, and she had already arrived at the same destination and was simply waiting for him to catch up. "She may not," he started. "She's alive," Cora said. It was not a hope. It was a statement made with the confidence of a woman who has been paying attention to things that other people have been too busy performing to notice. Wade pulled on his frozen coat. It was stiff from the cold, the outer layer rigid, and he had to work his arms into it by force. He pulled on his second pair of socks and his boots and his heaviest scarf. He found his heavy wool cap and pulled it down over his ears. His hands, when he checked them, had the preliminary numbness. That means the cold has been working on them and they need to be careful. He found the rope coiled by the back door. He tied one end to the door handle, tested the knot 3 times. He looked at the fire, which was settling into its final phase, and at the chair beside the stove that he would burn next. He looked at Cora. She came to him and put her hands on either side of his face, which were the same hands that had been warming his face after each outdoor trip for 3 days, and which were steady now, completely steady, the way they always were when things were hardest. He put his hands over hers. Then he opened the door. The storm came in like something that had been waiting outside specifically for this moment. It was colder than it had been any time in the previous 3 days. Colder than he had words for a cold that was not a matter of temperature but of totality, as if the concept of warmth had been removed from the world entirely and only forgotten about by the interior of their cabin, and the storm was here to correct the oversight. The wind hit him full in the face, and he turned his head to the side and pushed through the door and pulled it shut behind him and stood in the white hell with his rope in his hand and Nora's cabin somewhere in the direction his body was facing. 100 yards. He had walked this distance 1,000 times in summer. He knew every stone and fence post and irregularity in the ground between his back door and hers. None of that knowledge was available to him now. The world he was standing in had no stones and no fence posts and no ground. It had only white in every direction, at every distance, total and absolute and completely indifferent to his need to navigate it. He paid the rope out and moved forward. He fell in the first drift and got up. He fell again at the fence line where the wire was buried under 5 feet of pack and invisible, but the post was not. And it caught his shin, and he went down hard on his hands and knees, and for a 3-second interval, he stayed there with the cold pressing against him from every direction and the wind trying to flatten him to the earth. He got up. He moved forward, paying rope testing, each step leaning into the wind at an angle that kept him moving rather than stopping him. His fingers inside the gloves were approaching the state of not existing. His face was past pain and into the territory where pain has been replaced by something that is not sensation in any conventional sense, but is still sending messages, urgent one-note messages, about the difference between tissue that is alive and tissue that is about to not be. He fell again and did not know how far he had come. He could not see the rope behind him. He could not see anything. He was operating on direction and stubbornness, and the knowledge that somewhere in the white ahead of him there was a woman who had built something in the earth, that the earth was keeping warm, and his son was burning up in a bed in a cabin that was going to be as cold as the outside world in another 2 hours. He was on his hands and knees in a drift when he saw it. A light. It was nothing dramatic. It was a small yellow rectangle dimmed by distance and the density of the snow hanging in the white like something from a different world. It was the color of a lamp flame behind glass, which is the color of warmth and human occupancy, and all the things the storm was trying to negate. It was entirely steady. The storm moved around it without touching it. Wade stared at it for a moment that felt long, but was probably 3 seconds. Then he moved toward it with everything he had left. He hit the wall of the cabin before he saw it, a log wall solid and cold on the outside, but radiating even through the frozen surface some warmth that his face pressed against it could detect. He worked his way along it to the door. He found the door. He raised his fist and hit it. The sound was wrong, dull muffled his hand, already too numb to produce a proper knock. He hit it again harder using his whole arm. He hit it a third time and shouted, but the wind took the sound from his mouth before it reached the wood. He hit the door with the flat of his arm, his elbow, his shoulder, whatever part of him was capable of generating a sound that might travel through 12 inches of log to the person on the other side. The door opened. The warmth that came out of that cabin struck him differently than he expected. It was not the aggressive blast of an overheated room, the kind of heat that scorches the face and makes the eyes water. It was something slower and more complete, a warmth with depth to it, a warmth that had been building for days rather than hours, the kind that moves through a person the way genuine comfort moves from the outside inward, finding the cold places and replacing them one by one with something steady and sure. His body received it not with relief, but with a bewildered gratitude, the way a man receives something he had stopped believing he deserved. Nora stood in the doorway. She was in her shirt and a heavy apron. Her white hair was pinned back. She was holding a lamp. She looked at the frozen snow-cake shape in her doorway with an expression that contained no surprise whatsoever, only a quiet, weary, completely settled recognition, as though she had looked out the window sometime in the last 4 days and already seen this moment coming and had simply been waiting for it to arrive. She looked at him steadily. "Wade," she said. Her voice was calm and even and entirely warm. "Come in." She stepped back and he came in, and she closed the door behind him, and the sound of the storm cut off so completely and so suddenly that the silence of the cabin was for a moment louder than the storm had been. He stood in the middle of the room and dripped snowmelt onto the floorboards and shook not from cold. The warmth of the room was already doing its work, but from the thing that lives below the cold, that the cold had been keeping compressed, that warmth releases when it arrives in sufficient quantity. The shaking was not temperature. It was everything else. May Sutton was sitting at the table with a cup of tea. She looked at him with steady, knowing eyes and said nothing because nothing needed saying, and she understood that. He looked at the walls. He looked at the small stove where a fire burned at what he would have called, 3 days ago, a criminally inadequate rate. 3 pieces of wood, maybe 4, burning with the quiet confidence of something that knows exactly what it is doing and does not need to shout about it. He looked at the floor, which was warm under his feet through his boots in a way that no floor above ground had any right to be in a storm of this magnitude. He put his hands still shaking against the log wall beside him. The wood was warm, not the surface warmth of a wall next to a roaring fire, the kind that is hot at arm's length and cold at the perimeter. Something that came from the other side of the wall, from the earth side, from the mass of insulated ground that had been absorbing the geothermal baseline for weeks while the storm raged 6 feet above it. It was the warmth of something that had not participated in the disaster. It was the warmth of a principle patiently applied. He understood it then, not as an idea, but as a physical fact he could feel through his palm. His own cabin had been a vessel trying to generate heat faster than it lost it, and the storm had made that a race he could never win. This cabin was not fighting. It had been placed with precision and forethought in the one location the storm could not reach, not behind thicker walls or with a larger fire, but below the surface where the Earth's own temperature held its ground regardless of what the sky was doing. He had built for scale. She had built for position. These were not equivalent strategies, and the storm had made the distinction unmistakable. "You're fire," he said. His voice was a broken thing, rougher than he intended. "It's so small." "The fire is for light," Nora said. She had gone to the range and was already pouring hot water into a mug, her movements unhurried and deliberate. "The warmth comes from the earth. The walls aren't losing it. There's nothing outside to take it." He stood with this and could feel the truth of it with his hands still flat on the wall. His stove had been fighting -35 across every square inch of his cabin's exterior. Her stove was doing nothing more than topping off a reservoir of warmth that the earth had been building for 4 days without any help from fire at all. He had spent 3 days burning the world around him to stay alive. She had spent 3 days reading her book. "We ran out of wood," he said. The words came out scraped clean of anything that wasn't the truth. "I burned a chair. The cradle." His voice stopped working for a moment. He made it work again. "Arlo has a fever. He's bad. Cora's with him. The fire won't last another hour." Nora set the mug on the table. Her face had not changed in the way faces change. When they received news, it had moved in a different direction toward a kind of focused activation, the face of someone whose preparations have arrived at the moment they were made for. She walked to the back wall of the cabin, to the low plank door, set into the logs that anyone else would have taken for a pantry entrance, and she lifted the latch. "Come," she said, "I'll show you." The lamp she carried threw a long, flickering oval of light down the wooden steps and into the passage beyond. Wade stood at the threshold of the low doorway and looked down. His eyes, still adjusting from the white blindness of the storm, took a moment to resolve what they were seeing. The steps were plain-cut wood, 5 of them, each one sunk level into the earth. Below them, the passage extended into a darkness that the lamp had not yet fully reached, and on either side of the passage, the earth walls were close and straight, held in place by the repeating pattern of heavy timber frames, thick legs angled to match the walls, a solid collar beam across the top, the whole structure locked and patient and completely indifferent to the 6 feet of frozen earth pressing against it from outside. He went down. The change in the air began at the second step. It was not a dramatic change. It was a modulation, a slow, authoritative neutrality replacing the extremes above. The cold that had been inside him since he left his own door began to encounter something it could not overcome. Not heat, resistance. The deep, settled geological stubbornness of Earth that has not been cold since before any living thing could care about the distinction. At the bottom of the steps, Wade stopped and put his hand against the earth wall. It was cool, slightly damp, slightly, and alive with the kind of warmth that has nothing to do with fire, the warmth of mass and depth and time, the warmth of a planet that has been generating heat from its own interior since before the first stone of the first mountain range ever pushed above the surface. 40 degrees, perhaps. By any normal standard, it was cold. But after what he had been standing in for 4 days, 40 degrees felt like standing in a patch of summer. He followed her down the passage. Their footsteps made soft sounds on the packed earth floor. His heavy and slightly unsteady, hers quiet and sure. The lamp she carried cast the A-frames in repeating patterns of shadow and amber light, the timbers dark and dense, and fitted together with a precision that was visible even by lamplight. He ran his hand along the lagging boards as he walked and felt the earth pressing behind them, pressing with the enormous impersonal weight of everything above, and the boards did not flex. The frames did not flex. The joints held everything in its right relationship, the pressure distributed and managed and made harmless by the simple act of giving it nowhere it could push without being met by equal resistance. He thought of his woodpile. He thought of it standing exposed on the south side of his property, proud and open and utterly vulnerable to the exact forces it was supposed to defeat, and he felt something in his chest that was the architectural equivalent of what he had felt when he saw the ice-welded logs, the recognition of a design flaw so fundamental that no amount of scale could compensate for it. He had built for quantity. She had built for principle. He had spent his entire adult life not knowing the difference. The passage was 40 feet, and they reached the far end in the time it takes to have a thought you are not ready to finish. Nora mounted the steps and pushed open the door at the top. The woodshed. Wade came up the steps and straightened and looked. It was everything his own pile was not. The wood was stacked to the rafters along 3 walls split and organized with the same systematic precision that characterized everything else Nora had built here. The pieces were sorted by size kindling, at the bottom split pine, in the middle tiers the dense rounds of seasoned oak at the top. Not a single flake of snow had reached any of it. Every piece was exactly as it had been stacked, dry, cool, accessible, ready. He reached out and picked up a piece of split oak from the middle tier. It lifted free without resistance. He turned it in his hands. It was smooth and slightly cool to the touch, the way well-seasoned hardwood is cool, not cold, not damp, just settled at the ambient temperature of a protected space. It weighed what it should weigh. He stood holding it and thought about the logs he had been breaking free from his own frozen pile. Heavy with ice and water, the extra burden of a plan that had not accounted for what the winter could actually do. Then he saw the alcove. In the back corner of the shed, a small iron brazier sat on a stone pad with charcoal laid ready inside it. On a wooden shelf above it, two folded blankets neat and squared. A small lantern wick trimmed oil full. A covered pot, he lifted the lid, and steam rose carrying the smell of beef broth, an onion, and something herbal he could not name, but that smelled in this moment like everything necessary. Beside the pot, a tin of hardtack, a cloth parcel of dried apples, a sealed bottle of laudanum, a packet of willow bark, a roll of clean bandaging, two tin mugs set side by side. He looked at this arrangement for a long time. It was not the arrangement of someone who had heard a knock at the door and put together what she could. It was the arrangement of someone who had known weeks ago that there would be a knock at the door and had decided what that person would need when they arrived and had assembled it and kept it ready. The knock was not a possibility she was hoping would not come. It was a certainty she was hoping could be made easier. The broth was still warm. He turned to Nora. "You knew we'd come," he said. His voice was not accusatory. It was the voice of a man who has arrived after a long journey by a difficult route at a place that was waiting for him. Nora was quiet for a moment. The lamplight moved on the wall beside her. "I hoped you wouldn't need to," she said, "but I prepared as if you would." The silence that followed this was not empty. It had a density to it, the way silence has weight when something true has been said in a place where truth has been waiting a long time to be spoken. Wade set the piece of oak down. He looked at the two tin mugs set side by side on the shelf. Two, not one. She had set out two mugs weeks ago in late October before the first snow had fallen. He tried to hold the full meaning of this, the foresight of it, the quality of care that it represented, the care of a person who thinks past herself to the stranger who will need something and makes that provision quietly without announcement, without any expectation of acknowledgement. He had called this a folly. He had said the word in a public place with laughter behind it, and the word had spread because words like that spread when they confirm what people want to believe. And she had listened to him say it and had gone back to work with the shovel in her hands and said nothing because the work was what mattered and the word was only a word. He turned to her. There was something else he needed to know. "Where did you learn this?" he said. "All of it." Nora looked at him for a moment. Then she turned and went back down the steps. He followed her through the tunnel and up into the cabin where May looked up briefly from her tea and then looked away again, giving him the privacy of whatever was happening in his face. Nora went to the kitchen cabinet and reached to the middle shelf. She brought down a journal, plain cover brown cloth, the spine reinforced with rawhide. She carried it to the kitchen table, set it down, opened it to a page near the front, and turned it so he could read it. The handwriting on the open pages was precise and slightly forward-leaning, the handwriting of a man trained to write specifications. He recognized some of the terminology from conversations with Everett Gale in the early years of the settlement, when Everett had advised him on the drainage line for the lower road. Notes on geothermal gradients, sketches of shoring systems, theories about passive thermal regulation in structures built below grade. He turned the page. The handwriting changed. A different hand, entirely denser, more angular, written with a compression that came from the habit of saying a great deal in limited space. The pages were full margin to margin, every inch used. There were diagrams more detailed than the ones in the earlier pages with dimensions labeled and systems cross-referenced. There were tables of temperature records organized by date and depth pulled from measurements taken in this specific soil, at this specific altitude, over years of patient observation. There were pages of stress calculations for the shoring frames worked through, step by step, with methodical thoroughness. He turned to the page that held the full technical drawing, the cross-section, the labeled dimensions, the shoring detail, the waterproofing layer. The ventilation baffles all of it, a complete specification. He looked up at Nora. "This is yours," he said. "Yes," she said. "All of it, from—" He gestured toward the front pages. "Everett started it," she said. He had the ideas. He saw what the problem was, and he knew the direction of the answer. She paused. But he got sick before he could work it through. I kept going. Wade looked at the massive pages in Nora's hand compared to the smaller section in Everett's. He thought about what he had known of Nora Gale, which was very little, and what he had assumed about her, which was the particular combination of vague benevolence and complete inattention that the settlement had extended to a quiet older woman living alone at the edge of things. He had seen her and had not seen her at all. He turned to the last page that had writing on it. It was in Everett's hand again, the forward-leaning, precise hand of the front pages. But the writing was different from the careful specification notes. It was looser, less controlled, the writing of someone for whom the physical act of writing had become difficult. A few lines only at the top of an otherwise blank page. He read them. Nora will know what to do with this. 6 words. He read them twice. He read them a third time, and on the third reading they opened up, and he understood what they were. They were not a note to a reader. They were not instructions. They were the last act of a man who had spent 20 years working with material and structure and the language of load and pressure and support, recognizing in the final accounting of what he had built and what he had left that the most important thing he had ever contributed to was not a mine shaft or a drainage line or a foundation. It was this, and what she would do with it would be entirely her own. Wade put the journal down on the table. He stood with his hands flat on either side of it, and his head bowed, and he did not say anything for a moment. The fire made its small, patient sounds. May was very still on the other side of the room. He had been wrong about Nora Gale in the way that is not a simple error of information. He had been wrong in the way you are wrong when you look at a thing and do not see it because you have already decided what it is. He had looked at her and had assigned her a place in the order of things that had nothing to do with her actual dimensions and everything to do with his own. He raised his head. His eyes were wet. He did not try to prevent this because there was no performance in it, and no one in this room required him to perform anything. "We were fools," he said. His voice was a different instrument from the voice he had arrived with. Something had gone out of it, the carrying quality, the boom that filled rooms and settled arguments. What was left was quieter and more direct. "I was a fool. I looked at everything you built, and I called it—" He stopped. "My son is sick. My wood is gone. And you were sitting here with broth on the stove and 2 tin mugs on the shelf." Nora looked at him. What was in her face was not the satisfaction he might have expected, and not the pain of old wounds being acknowledged. It was something more complete than any of those, the expression of a person who has been carrying a thing alone for a long time, and has finally had that weight recognized, not vindicated, not compensated for, just seen. "Your boy needs the willow bark," she said, "and the broth, and warmth that stays." She moved toward the passage door. "Let's get him here." They worked quickly after that with the focused efficiency that takes over when the time for other things is past. Nora prepared the small sledge from the woodshed, a flat-bottomed runner she had built herself narrow enough to navigate the passage. She loaded it, the covered pot of broth, 2 good blankets, an armload of split oak. May helped without being asked, moving with the practical competence of a woman who has spent 40 years solving problems with whatever was at hand. Wade carried the wood through the passage in 4 trips at a pace that was faster and calmer and more efficient than any of the desperate, frozen journeys to his own woodpile. Because here there was no storm and no ice and no arithmetic of diminishing returns. Here there was a passage and a lamp and dry wood and a woman who had thought of everything. They crossed from the woodshed to his cabin in stages, using the woodshed itself as what Nora called the airlock, the place where the outside world and the inside world exchanged their terms. They came out of the shed into the full force of the storm, still furious, still minus 37 degrees Fahrenheit in wind and white, nothing in every direction, and they fought across the 100 yards with the sledge between them, Nora on one side and Wade on the other, moving at an angle that used the wind rather than fighting it, directly following the rope Wade had left running from his back door. They arrived at Wade's door with their lungs burning and their faces locked in the rigid expression that extreme cold produces, and Cora opened the door before Wade had finished knocking. Cora looked at Nora. Something passed between the 2 women in that look that had no equivalent in language. A recognition, an acknowledgement, a transaction, conducted entirely without words in the space of 2 seconds, incomplete before Wade had fully registered it was happening. Cora stepped back. They came in. The cabin was cold. Not the cold of outside, but the preliminary encroaching cold of a space whose heat source had been inadequate for too long. The stove had the small fire from the last pieces of the cradle, and it was doing what it could, but the walls had given up their accumulated warmth, and the room temperature was perhaps 50 degrees, which was survivable, but not for a sick child. Nora went directly to Arlo. She sat on the edge of the bed and put her palm on his forehead, the practiced palm of a woman who has taken temperatures this way for many years and trusts the information. She looked at his chest, rising and falling. She pulled back the blanket and looked at his color, which was wrong too. Flushed, too bright, the particular red of a fever that has been working on a small body for too many hours. She put her ear to his chest and listened. She looked at Cora. How long has he been breathing this way? Since last night, Cora said. She was controlling her voice by main force. Nora unpacked the cloth parcel from the sledge. Willowbark measured and ready. She made it into a preparation with a cup of hot water from the broth pot and helped Arlo drink it half asleep, his mouth working automatically at the rim of the tin mug. She gave him broth next spoonful by spoonful, the way you give anything to a body that is using everything it has for something else. He accepted it without opening his eyes. Wade had the stove fed properly now, the dry oak from Nora's shed, throwing the kind of generous, clean heat that good seasoned hardwood produces when nothing is fighting it. The room temperature began to climb immediately. He needs to come to my cabin, Nora said, standing. Cora looked at Arlo. She looked at the door behind which the storm was still working its intentions on the world. Through the passage, Wade said. The passage goes to my shed, Nora said, not to yours. She looked at him steadily. But we can move him on the sledge covered quickly. It's 100 yards. The wind is behind us going that direction. She paused. It's the difference between 50 degrees and 65. With the willow bark working and the warmth steady. She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Cora was already at the chest pulling the spare blankets. They wrapped Arlo in everything blankets, his father's heaviest coat on top, a wool cap pulled over his ears. He was half-conscious, not fully aware of what was happening, which was in some ways a mercy. Wade lifted him with a gentleness that was striking in a man of his size, the gentleness of someone handling the most important thing he has ever touched, and laid him on the sledge and tucked the edge of the blankets under him. The crossing was brutal and fast. Nora led. Wade pulled the sledge. Cora pushed from behind. The wind was at their backs for this direction, and Nora had been right about it. It shoved them forward rather than stopping them, a terrible assistance, but an assistance nonetheless. They covered the 100 yards in under 2 minutes, which were 2 of the longest minutes any of them had ever stood inside. The woodshed door, the passage, the steps. The moment the passage door closed behind the last of them and the underground air closed in, Arlo stirred. Not fully, not consciousness, not awareness, but a stirring, a physical response to the change in the fundamental conditions around him. His body, which had been concentrating everything it had on the task of surviving the cold, felt the cessation of that demand and began tentatively to reallocate its resources. Cora felt it through the blanket when she put her hand on his chest. She looked at Nora. Nora nodded once. They brought him up into the cabin and put him in Nora's bed, and Cora sat beside him and held his hand and watched his face with the total, unwavering attention of a mother who has been frightened for her child and is now permitting herself very carefully to begin being less frightened. Through the rest of that day and into the night, the cabin filled, not all at once. In ones and twos, as the smoke from Nora's chimney, which had not stopped at any point in 4 days visible from the settlement, at moments when the storm gave a brief grudging reprieve, in its density drew people the way a fire draws people who are cold. They came the way Wade had come, desperate and half-frozen, following ropes or walls or memory or nothing at all, arriving at Nora's door with the specific expression of people who have abandoned a plan that was not working and have come finally to the place they should have been going all along. The Fitch family came the father's ear, showing the dead white of serious frostbite, the 2 children bundled together in a single coat that had been wrapped around them both. A young man named Jarrett came alone, barely coherent, having walked through a drift nearly over his head on the track between the livery and the western end of the settlement. A woman named Birdsall came with her infant, the baby silent in a way that frightened everyone. until Nora unwrapped the outer layers and the warmth of the room reached the child, and it started to cry, which was the best sound anyone in that cabin had heard in 4 days. Wade met them at the door as they arrived. He helped them in. He took their outer layers and helped them to the warmth and brought them broth and did not once in all of this perform the authority that had been his habitual manner in every public gathering in Harrow's Creek for the past 6 years. He was simply useful. He was a man who understood with a completeness that had come to him fast and hard that usefulness is not the same as leadership, and that what the people arriving at this door needed from him was not direction, but service. May made soup. She moved around Nora's small kitchen with the instinctive efficiency of a capable woman in a space that was not her own, finding what was there and turning it into what was needed. Her movements quiet and her hands steady. Cora did not leave Arlo's side except to help the Birdsall infant holding the baby against her chest and walking with it until it stopped crying and slept, and then sitting back down beside her son. Nora managed the tunnel. She made 6 trips through the passage that afternoon and evening, bringing wood from the shed in steady, manageable loads. Not arm loads carried in desperation, but wheelbarrow loads moved with the same unhurried deliberateness she had brought to every part of this work. She kept the stove at the right temperature, warm enough to maintain the room at a consistent 65 degrees, not so hot as to consume wood at a rate that could not be sustained. It was a balance, and she maintained it the way she maintained everything, by paying attention and making small corrections before they became large ones. The storm was still outside, still furious, still doing everything it had been doing for 4 days. But it was outside, and the people who had arrived at Nora's cabin were inside, and between those two states was 40 feet of earth and timber and the particular genius of a woman who had spent 2 years learning a thing that no one had asked her to learn and building a thing that no one had asked her to build, because she had understood that the time to build the thing you need is before you need it, and that understanding is not diminished by the fact that other people call it a folly. Not everyone survived the wolf winter of 1887. The storm broke on the morning of the 18th of November, 6 days after it began, with an abruptness that was almost as startling as its arrival. A cessation of wind, a lift in the cloud cover, a shaft of winter sunlight falling across the snowfield to the east of the settlement in a way that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances, and was beautiful still, though the beauty had grief in it. The world that the light fell on was not the world that had existed before the storm. The settlement of Harrow's Creek had been altered in ways that would take months to fully assess. 3 cabins were structurally compromised by the weight of the accumulated snow on their roofs. The frame houses, the ambitious ones with glass windows from Denver, had not been designed for what had come, and their roof lines had sagged, and in one case partially collapsed. The livestock losses were severe. Fences were buried, outbuildings destroyed, the lower bridge taken out a second time by ice in the creek that had built up and then released suddenly when the temperature shifted in the storm's final hours. 4 people had not made it to Nora's cabin. Theodore Carver was one of them. He was found in his own bed on the morning after the storm broke by the first people who made their way to check on him. He had apparently gone to bed on the second night of the storm and not woken up, which was, in the opinion of everyone who knew him, almost certainly the way he had intended to go, quietly without drama, in his own space in his own time. He was 81 years old and had been underground more hours of his life than he had been above it. And there was a rightness to the manner of his passing that grief did not cancel, though the grief was real. A man named Pryor had died attempting to reach the settlement from his isolated claim to the north, found in a drift on the 3rd day by 2 men who had tied themselves together and searched the northern track. An elderly couple named the Abbotts, who had been the settlement's oldest residents and had stubbornly refused to leave their well-built cabin for anyone else's, had died of the cold when their chimney iced over on the 4th day, and no one reached them in time. These deaths were mourned with the specific gravity of a community that has been shown its own fragility and is sitting with the knowledge. There was no false comfort in the mourning, no easy repositioning of the losses as acceptable or inevitable. They were losses and they were held as such, but Harrow's Creek had not been erased. In the weeks after the storm, as the settlement dug out and assessed and began the slow work of repairing what could be repaired and replacing what could not, a particular quality settled over the community that was different from what had been there before. The brash confidence of the young settlement, the certainty that preparation meant accumulation, That strength meant size, that the right answer to the wilderness was to build things large enough and loud enough to simply defeat it. That confidence had been broken open, and what was visible inside it was the more complicated truth that the land did not respond to volume, and that survival required something other than force of will. Wade Holt felt this more than anyone because he had embodied the old certainty more than anyone, and its failure had been most directly visible in him. In the weeks after the storm, he did not speak much at the general store gatherings. He worked, which was what he knew how to do, digging out the compromised cabins, helping rebuild the thatch roof, organizing the work parties that cleared the lower track. He was useful in the way he had always been useful, but the usefulness had changed in character. He was no longer useful from the front of the room. He was useful from the place where the work was, which is a different thing. It was May Sutton who told him on a mild afternoon in late January, when the snow had settled and the settlement was beginning to breathe again, that she thought spring was the right time to go to Nora. "I know," he said. "Not to thank her," May said. "She was precise about this. Thanking her is easy. That's not what's needed." "I know," he said again. In the first week of March, with the snow beginning to soften at the south-facing edges and the first exploratory bird song appearing in the cottonwood along the creek, Wade Holt walked to the last cabin on the western edge of Harrow's Creek. He went alone, which was his decision, though he had spoken with the others and they had agreed that the first approach should be this way. He walked the track he had walked 100 times past the fence line. He had helped run past the kitchen garden that was still snow-covered, but would be something again in a month. He stood at Nora's front door and knocked. She opened it. She was in her work clothes, a canvas apron over her wool dress, and she was holding a piece of paper covered in calculations, which she folded and put in her apron pocket before she looked at him. She looked at him with the level reading expression he recognized now as simply how she looked at the world, with the attention of someone for whom looking is a form of respect. He took his hat off. He held it in both hands. He had prepared words, had worked them out in the long weeks since the storm, had tried various versions of what needed to be said and discarded most of them because they were either too much or not enough. What he said in the end was simple because the simple version was the true version, and anything added to it would have diluted it. "Teach us," he said. "Teach us what you know." Nora looked at him for a long moment. The March light was thin but real, the first light in months that had warmth in its intention, even if not yet in its delivery. It fell on the two of them standing at the threshold and on the faint lines in the snow behind him that showed even under 2 feet of late winter packed the gentle mounds of earth that marked the course of the passage. "Come in," she said. "We'll start with the soil." She taught them through the spring and into the summer, and the teaching was not what most of them had expected, because they had expected technique, and she gave them that, but first she gave them something else. She took them out into the land around the settlement on the mild mornings of April, and she showed them how to read it. She showed them where the frost line ran deep and where it was shallower, based on soil type and slope aspect and drainage pattern and the specific behavior of the snow the previous winter in different parts of the plateau. She showed them how to identify the sites where a structure would be working with the land's own tendencies and the sites where it would be fighting them. She showed them how Harrow's Creek's best cabins had been sited largely by luck and its worst ones by optimism, and she showed them the difference without naming names because the point was the principle and not the embarrassment. Then she taught them the technique. She taught them how to dig a proper trench, the tool selection, the progression through soil layers, the critical angle of the battered walls, the way to read the clay for signs of instability before the instability read itself into a collapse. She taught them the shoring, how to select timber, how to season it, how to cut the A-frame joints so that they tightened under load rather than loosening, how to calculate the number of frames needed for a given span. She taught them the lagging and the waterproofing and the backfilling and the sod replacement. And in all of it, she taught not only the what, but the why, because a person who understands only the what can only do what they have been shown, and a person who understands the why can solve a problem they have never encountered before. So she was patient. She was not particularly gentle in the sense of softening the parts that were difficult or embarrassing, but she was not unkind either. She was simply clear, which is its own form of respect. Wade was her most consistent student. He came every morning that the work on the settlement allowed, which was most mornings through May and June, and he came with his notebook open and his carpenter's pencil ready, and the specific quality of attention that belongs to a person who has understood at some cost that they do not know everything. He asked good questions. He made careful drawings. He occasionally offered suggestions that came from his own deep knowledge of structure and load. And when those suggestions were good, Nora incorporated them without ceremony. And when they were not, she explained why, without softening the explanation, and he wrote down the explanation. By midsummer, the sounds of Harrow's Creek had changed. The rhythm of the settlement, which had always been predominantly the rhythm of hammers and axes of things being built up and cut down and lifted and driven, now included a new beat, the sound of shovels, the sound of earth being moved in the patient, purposeful way of people who have a plan and enough time to execute it correctly. Besides 7 of the cabins in Harrow's Creek, long, neat rectangles appeared in the earth, their walls cut clean and angled, their growing piles of excavated soil arranged with a tidiness that reflected the care being brought to the work. The men who dug them did not call them follies. Nora walked the settlement that summer in a way she never had before, not because she sought the attention, but because the work required her presence, and her presence in the places where things were being built was no longer remarkable or contested. She knelt in the trenches beside men half her age and showed them the specific quality of clay they were looking for, pressed a handful of it between her palm to demonstrate its cohesion, showed them the difference between soil that would hold a battered wall and soil that needed additional shoring. She examined their joints and said what was wrong with them and what was right. She answered questions and asked her own. She was not large. She was not loud. She did not perform authority. She simply had it in the form that authority takes when it cannot be separated from competence. When the person in front of you demonstrably knows what they are talking about, and what they are talking about matters, and this is enough. Nora Gale lived for 11 more years after the Wolf Winter of 1887. She never held a formal position in Harrow's Creek. No title, no seat on any committee, no role that required acknowledgement or ceremony. But her word in matters of structure and siting and the relationship between a building and the land beneath it was the word that settled the question quietly, and finally the way questions are settled when the person with the knowledge simply has it and everyone has stopped pretending otherwise. She revised her notebook twice in those years. The second revision included contributions from Wade Holt annotated in his large clear carpenter's hand, the kind of additions that could only come from someone who had spent years putting principles into practice and had developed his own understanding of where the theory and the material agreed and where they required negotiation. Nora incorporated these without comment except to correct 2 calculations in his section that were slightly off, which he accepted with the equanimity of a man who has learned what it feels like to be taught. She died in the spring of 1898 on a morning when the snow was finally off the plateau and the kitchen garden was showing its first green in the cabin she had shared with Everett and then kept alone in the bed that was still the warmest bed in the warmest structure in Harrow's Creek. May Sutton was with her, which was right. May had been with her through everything that mattered, from the buttermilk on the porch railing to the soup she had made in the crowded cabin on the 5th night of the Wolf Winter, to the 11 years of quiet friendship that needed no explanation because it had been built on a foundation that was already understood. They buried her on the small rise to the west of the settlement, where the plateau opened up and the view ran unobstructed to the mountains. Wade Holt dug the grave himself, working alone in the early morning before the others came. He dug it 6 feet deep. He made the walls straight and smooth the way she had taught him. The settlement mourned in the way settlements mourn someone who has been at the center of things without ever standing at the front, with a grief that is partly for the person and partly for the particular kind of knowing that existed only in her and is now past the reach of questions. They told each other stories in the weeks after the way people do when they are trying to keep something from receding entirely, and the stories were all the same story from different angles, the story of a woman who knew something that looked like nothing and turned out to be everything. The passages they had built, the network of covered ways running under the properties of Harrow's Creek, were kept and maintained and added to in the years that followed. Some of them connected now, a shared passage running between adjacent properties expanded to allow the passage of a loaded cart. They were part of the settlement's architecture in the way that essential things become part of architecture no longer noticed, no longer remarkable, simply present in the way that practical wisdom becomes part of a place's structure once it has been